The title of this talk is Doing in Private What Men Did in Public, Women's Elite Study Clubs in Northwest Tennessee. I am Dr. Renee LaFleur. I am a history professor at the University of Tennessee at Martin, and I'm the director of our Center for Women and Gender Equality. In this research project, I was taking a look at what women during the progressive era, how they were experiencing their independence and moving into the public sphere. Throughout the progressive era, women were involved in various reform projects, which moved them out of the realm of the private into the public. What I found is that when you looked at women's study clubs, it allowed women this middle ground, this space where they could do the things that men did in public, but they did it within the private realm of a group of women. Women who they were friends with, who they were comfortable with. They had this sense of camaraderie with each other. And so these study clubs allowed them this freedom that they might not have had in the public realm, but the opportunity to do things that weren't available to them in the private, like at home. When you look at study clubs, women's studies clubs across the United States, and during the progressive era, there's this enormous boom in the popularity of women's clubs. And there's all different types. There's like gaming type clubs, clubs with crafts where people sewed or they knit or made lace. There were book clubs. In this case, I'm taking a look at study clubs. These would be clubs where women were interested in intellectual and artistic pursuits. So those are some of the clubs I'm taking a look at. In some places you can find the study clubs allow the women not only to do those things in private, what men did in public, but it also created this avenue for women to become involved in civic reform. And a lot of times you see that progression, that women would join one of these study clubs, and then they move along and they become more and more active in civic engagement. And then pretty soon they're involved in more and more in the public sphere. The study clubs I took a look at in Northwest Tennessee, in particular, Martin, Tennessee, that really wasn't the case. These women really valued their study clubs and what they did within those clubs. And while they do become involved in civic engagement, particularly around World War I, most of what they really wanted to do was continue the intellectual and musical pursuits in the clubs that they belonged to. And so it's really important to look at study clubs, not just in larger cities, but also in rural areas, to really get a sense of what and how women use these study clubs to their own benefit. So like I said, I'm looking at elite study clubs in Northwest Tennessee. And if we look at the specific region I'm talking about, Martin, Tennessee is where we're focused here. So I've got Martin circled here on the map, if you're not familiar with Tennessee, in the northwest corner of the state. You'll notice that, Martin's quite a distance from the major cities of Memphis and Nashville, and it's also almost, 50 to 60 miles north of Jackson. So it's a pretty rural area here. Martin, interestingly, at least to me, got started kind of late as a town. It was incorporated in 1873, and so by the time we're talking about here with these women's study clubs, the city had only been around for about 30 years. The population in 1910 was 2,228, and with a town that small, I was surprised to find so many study clubs. There were 3 study clubs in Martin, and then a whole host of other types of church clubs, game clubs, and craft clubs as well. But there are 3 study clubs that I'm going to focus on today. But Martin in the early 1900s was this bustling town. It was formed at the crossroads of 2 railroads. And so it had a very, very vibrant business community, which I think is part of the reason why it had so many study clubs, is that there was a class of white middle-class women who had time and means to be involved in a club like this. As I mentioned before, I'm looking specifically at elite study clubs. So these, at least in Martin, were made up of white middle-class women I haven't in the historical record, at least that I've been able to find in Martin, I haven't found any clubs run by African American women. I'm sure they probably existed within their churches, but the secular study clubs I'm studying, I haven't seen any African American driven clubs at this point. So the clubs I'm going to be talking about are primarily of white, middle and upper middle class women. And so they're going to be these sort of well-connected women. The first group that was formed in Martin is the 20th Century Club. And it was founded in 1901 by a woman named Mrs. Virginia Martin Gardner. A couple things about Mrs. Gardner. One, that's not actually a photo of Mrs. Gardner. I don't have a photo of her. And so that's a photo of her daughter-in-law, which I'll talk about her in just a moment. Whenever you see Mrs. Virginia Martin Gardner's name printed, it was always Mrs. Virginia Martin Gardner or Mrs. Virginia Gardner. And I point that out because almost all of the other women, I say the women in the things I've been researching anyway, always listed their names as Mrs. husband's first and last name. Okay. So sometimes it was very hard to track who was who because the women's individual names get erased once they are married and they only go by their husband's names. So it's at least in the published newspaper records. And so it's hard to sometimes figure out who these women are on their own. But Mrs. Gardner always had her name. It was never her husband's name. It was Mrs. Virginia Martin Gardner. And the other thing to know about Mrs. Virginia Martin Gardner is that she is of one of the Martins who founded the city of Martin. It was her brothers who were the founders of it. And so she was at the center of the elite community within Martin. And the photo here is Elender Wilson Gardner, who is the daughter-in-law of Virginia Gardner. And almost exclusively, you see her name listed as Mrs. John Gardner. John Gardner is Virginia Gardner's son. And she was also a member of the 20th Century Club. So that's the photo I have for her. But Mrs. Gardner had this sense in 1901 that she wanted to have a club that allowed for social engagement and then also speak to the interests that women had in literature. So she invites 11 women to her home on January 31st, 1901, and they formed the 20th Century Club, and she's elected the first president. The constitution of the club called for mutual improvement of its members in literature, the arts, sciences, and the vital issues of the day. They outlined a whole yearly plan of study, different books they were going to read, different topics they were going to study. And this is the way that they progressed, is studying these things. The members of the 20th Century Club, like I mentioned before, were part of the elite family, some of the most prominent families in Martin. One of the retrospectives of the club even noted this, said that the members of the club represented the noblest of qualities of Southern womanhood. The club has been elevating influence in the social and cultural life of Martin. So we have Mrs. Virginia Gardner, who is a descendant of the Martin family. She's well connected. Many of the other members were wives of the various mayors of Martin. The wife of the famous Dr. C.M. Sebastian was a member of the 20th Century Club as well. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Martin history, you don't know about Dr. Sebastian and why he's so famous. In the early 1800s, there was the 1890s, there was a yellow fever outbreak in Martin, and it got really bad. I think 50 people died from it. And there were two doctors in town, Sebastian and another one. The other doctor left because he was elderly. And it was Sebastian who stayed and took care of all of the sick people from this yellow fever outbreak. So he's this great, prominent Martin hero. He had one of the largest houses in town named Ivandale. And so his wife was a member of this group as well. And so we have this 20th Century Club that's made up of these elite white women. And they studied all kinds of things. They read George Eliot. They talked about art. They did biographical sketches. They took reading courses that were part of the Chautauqua movement. They studied different parts of the world. Mrs. Gardner even held in her home an evening where people could come and see artifacts from trips that she had taken. You know, it was all about trying to foster intellectual development in these women. And so the 20th Century Club, like I said, was founded in 1901. The next group that was formed, the next study club, is the Fortnightly Club, which was founded in 1907. Fortnightly Club gets its name in part from its motto. You take the first letter of each word of the motto and you get fortnightly, furthering of right thinking, nurturing ideals, giving head to lofty yearnings. So again, in the title, you can see that they are talking about intellectual pursuit, that this was something that women joined so that they could have these intellectual opportunities. The Fortnightly Club was also interesting in that they studied literature, they took up art, they did all of these things as well. Many of the members of the club were daughters of the members of the 20th Century Club. So Dr. Sebastian's two daughters were members of the Fortnightly Club as well. And so I have, well, here's some more of the scrapbook of the Constitution for the Fortnightly Club and some of their rules and how they ran their organization. But I have a photo here. This is a photo of a class at Hall Moody College in 1904. Hall Moody was a precursor to the University of Tennessee at Martin. And in this group of young women, several of these women were members of the Fortnightly Club. They'll graduate from this college and then they'll join the club a little bit later in their lives. And this woman here, her name was Neva. She was a member of the Fortnightly Club. And so the Fortnightly Club, a lot like the other ones, had this literature that they looked at and they discussed. And as you see here, they had this well-scripted constitution of how the organization was going to run, what membership was going to look like, what membership dues would be, how you determined attendance. They had all of these rules in place. And so when I talk about that middle ground, that place where women could do the things that you might do in public, this is what I'm talking about. They ran these organizations, they took leadership roles, they managed them, they were the secretaries, they were the treasurers. They were the ones that were in control of all of the things that you might see men doing in the public sphere, whether it was in politics or in business. You have women who are doing it here. The Fortnightly Club had, and actually all of the social clubs had their events listed in the social columns of the local paper. This was the Martin Mail. And so you could look through the Martin Mail and see what the Fortnightly Club was up to. And they usually had refreshments, and then they would have discussions, and usually a good time was had by all. The third study club that developed in Martin is the Philharmonic Club. And this one's a little different. The other two studied really literature and art. This one is primarily music. It's founded in 1912 by Florence Poynter. Florence Poynter was the music instructor at McFerrin College in Martin. And McFerrin College was like a finishing school, like a high school type school here. And she was the music teacher. And so you have this photo here is of her orchestra, 1907 and 1908. And the tall woman in the back here, that's Florence Poynter. And the reason she founds this group is really interesting and again plays to the role that these types of clubs played for women to give them opportunities they didn't have elsewhere. She said that, I'm going to read from a retrospective about it. Ever since Martin had been a town, there had been among us girls of acknowledged musical ability. Year after year, their beautiful dresses adorned with ruffles and lace, lovely girls gave recitals until they graduated. Then what became of them? A few taught here and there, The others, having no incentive, soon ceased to practice. Other duties came more urgent as time went on. Fingers grew stiff. Thus, the musical life of Martin centered almost wholly in the activities of teachers and their pupils. We decided that was not enough and that something would be done about it. So Pointer sees that these young women that she teaches in the realm of music go on and graduate, and then they have no opportunity to play anymore. They don't have opportunities to practice. They don't have opportunities to perform. There are other duties as wives, as women, as mothers, all start taking over, and they don't have the opportunity to perform. And so the Philharmonic Club, this musical club, was founded as a way to allow these women to continue the study of music and to continue having that musical cultivation that they liked. And then also to share that music with the community. And so the Philharmonic Club is created, to give women the space to do music where they didn't have anywhere else. In addition to playing music, they also studied it. They would have topics like orchestral works and workers in America. They would read and discuss music in addition to playing and performing it and trying to get concerts in the Martin area. So each of these study clubs formed, 1901, 1907, 1912, all sort of self-motivated with these intellectual and artistic pursuits. In 1916, each of them joined the Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs. The Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs was founded in 1896. And this again plays on the boom in women's clubs all across the United States. And most states had a federation like this that would coordinate actions of various women's clubs to centralized purposes. And this pledge of the Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs I have here gives you an idea of some of the things that they were focused on. They were interested in making homes and schools better. They were interested in scholarship, bettering lives, working towards civic health, preserving the natural beauty, encouraging the education and caretaking of children, and so on and so forth. And these are some of the things that the Federation was interested in. Until 1916, the Federation mainly consisted of clubs in East and Central Tennessee. And the clubs, there were no, besides Memphis, there really weren't any clubs, I guess Jackson, any clubs in Northwest Tennessee. In 1915, though, the Federation decided they were going to start focusing on trying to expand membership in the club, and their expansion worked. All three Martin women's clubs joined the Federation in 1916. So what does this mean for these study clubs? It means that they start to become more interested in civic engagement. They aren't just doing their intellectual pursuits, but now that they're part of this club, they'll be involved in some of the other fundraising events and the other activities that the Federation supports. So they'll start getting involved in those actions. The 20th Century Club supported the Federation's work on a traveling art exhibit. They gave money to help build a vocational school for girls in Tullahoma. They also supported the charities, including the Federation's Mountain Settlement School and different actions for the care of orphans in the state. And so joining this federation increased these women's activism beyond just the intellectual pursuits of the club, but also moved them out a little bit more into that public sphere. And then World War I happens, or the Great War. The Great War, as anybody who lives through wars like this, changed all aspects of their lives. And they started to shift their focus from doing some of the civic engagement pursuits of the Federation and focusing their attention on supporting the war. In their support for the war effort, the women's clubs in Martin were able to use the skills they developed in managing their own programs, their own clubs, and they were able to apply it to their actions with the Red Cross, their actions with raising money through Liberty Bond campaigns, and other things that they did to support the war effort. And so with the Great War, we see again the skills and the abilities that they had in these study clubs are applied in civic engagement or in patriotic activism that they took part in. The Red Cross was very active in Martin, and all of the clubs in various ways supported the actions of the Red Cross as much as possible. And they did it in the ways that generally fell within things that were acceptable for women to do. Sewing, knitting, organizing, fundraising, things like that. And so they were able to use those club skills in order to do this Red Cross work. When you look at the way that the clubs wrote about their war experience, they constantly said, yeah, pretty much the whole year, we just stopped doing what we were doing and started working for the Red Cross. They met at the Red Cross offices in downtown Martin on Main Street, and that's where they did their work communally, creating surgical dressings, knitting, making blankets, and some other things. The Red Cross was managed by a number of members of the various clubs too. And I have some clips here to show that of the way that they managed their organization. The Red Cross and the women who ran it weren't above shaming other women in order to get them to respond. In this announcement on the left, it says the holidays are over, but the war still is on. And this is my favorite line. We don't like to think the women of Martin are slackers, but our workrooms very often look as if some were not doing their duty. While it is not a very busy time with housekeepers, let us all rally to the cause and help put an end to this horrible war. The ladies would realize what a burden it puts upon a few to have to call every day to get workers. They would certainly make it convenient to come. And then the next day, there was another one of these shaming. If all the clubs, societies, and other organizations in Martin believed in doing their bit like the sewing square, our little city would merit a reputation for patriotism of which we might feel proud. And the sewing square had furnished an entire hospital, bed equipment, beds, sheets, towels, the whole shebang. Now, the Sewing Square is a group I don't know a lot about. I couldn't find any written records for them. They weren't a study club, so it also is not entirely within my research. But I did find this photo. This is the Sewing Square Club, meeting about 1920. And a number of the members, as far as I can tell, of the Sewing Square were also members of some of the study clubs that I do research. And so the Sewing Square was being praised by the Red Cross and trying to get the other groups to sort of step up and get this done. The members of the clubs, even when they were not being shamed, saw what they were doing as fitting their patriotic duties. They voted to not pursue programs for the year, to just devote their time to club work. They talked about how this was an important part of their duties in order to help the war effort is to do these things. So activism within the Red Cross, again, allowed these women to use the skills that they learned in their clubs and apply it to working for the war effort. Many of the leaders of the Red Cross were also members of these study clubs. Mrs. John Gardner, who I showed a photo of earlier, helped organize the local chapter, and she was a vice chair of the regional part of the Red Cross. The secretary, director of women's work, chairman of supplies, chairman of sewing department, chairman of surgical dressings department, were all members of the 20th Century Club, the Philharmonic Club, or both. So the women who were active in the clubs also then were active in the Red Cross. They also studied patriotic things during the war, or during the wartime too. If they did any studying during the wartime, it was on patriotic issues. I included some images here of some of the things that they sewed. The National Red Cross had specific guidelines on what they wanted and needed. And so here's some, this was published in Ladies Home Journal. These are different comfort kits and how to make them. And then also how to do knitting and how to make the different things that they needed. And so these women got instructions on specifically on what it was that they needed to make. In addition to sewing and knitting for the Red Cross, they also did other things to help the war effort. The Philharmonic Club gave a concert to raise money for the Red Cross. After expenses, it was $67.41. Roughly, that's about $1,000 in modern money that they raised. And so again, we see the Philharmonic Club using the skills that they developed in the club in order to raise money for the Red Cross. They also supported the war effort with raising money. So the Liberty Bond campaigns, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, was big in Martin as it was other places. And both the Philharmonic Club and the 20th Century Club buy Liberty Bonds and supported that part of the war effort. A Liberty Bond, the minimum you could buy was a $50 bond. That's the equivalent of $880 roughly in modern money. So that's a sizable donation for people to make. And the 20th Century Club and the Philharmonic Club do that. The Fortnightly Club doesn't. And it makes some sense. The Fortnightly Club is of younger members, and so they might not have that level of financial security. Instead, the Fortnightly Club contributed to the Smilage campaign, the coupon book campaign. And the Smilage campaign was much more affordable. For $1, a citizen could buy a book that included 25-cent coupons that allowed servicemen to get entertainment at Liberty theaters. And so it was a much cheaper way for them to contribute to the war effort and allow for servicemen to have some enjoyment while they're in the service. And so that's where they spent their money rather than on the Liberty bonds, which were a little bit more expensive. The women in the clubs also helped with the draft registration after the passage of the Selective Service Act. On June 5th, 1917, all men between the ages of 21 and 31 were required to register for the Selective Service. And so to help out with this process, there are registrars in different counties, and members of the 20th Century Club helped with that, taking down names, keeping a track of what was going on. And again, we see these women using the organizational skills they learned in the clubs and applying it here with managing the Selective Service. Within the Federation, the Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs, being part of the war effort was really, really important to the way that the Federation saw itself and the way that it tried to describe the importance of women's clubs. And they have a whole book outlining how all of the clubs contributed to the war effort. And this is an excerpt from the Fortnightly Club's report. And here you can see that the members of the clubs weren't just doing it because they had the skills, but they also saw that it was part of their patriotic engagement, part of being a citizen of the United States. That they've endeavored to help the cause of our country, both in spirit and in deed, to help make the world safe for democracy and to alleviate the suffering of the present war. You know, they believed in what it was that they were fighting for and working for. And War Work of Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs outlines what all of these clubs are up to. And they did a tremendous amount of work trying to support this war effort. And they were, like I said, very proud of the work that they did. One issue that's noticeably absent from the three women's clubs in Martin is the question of women's suffrage. And we know that the suffrage movement, of course, was not invisible at this time. In fact, leading up to the war and during the war, the women's movement was very, very active. but it's not mentioned in any of the club records that I have access to. It's not in the Martin Mail paper. It's not in the meeting minutes or the programs that they have. It's just completely missing. Now, you know, as a historian, we can't make conclusions based on that. All I can say is that I'm not aware that they talked about it. It's possible they talked about it. It didn't make it into the minutes. It's possible they never talked about it because they had other concerns. There's a whole host of reasons why it wasn't in there, but it is noticeably absent. And so trying to understand how these clubs fit with the suffrage movement is really difficult to discern without some indications like that. It isn't until after the war and after suffrage has passed that finally the Fortnightly Club, in their meeting plan for 1920 to 1921, they finally have some sort of political program. And they have one meeting where they're going to talk about, in this case, the Democratic platform, the outline of the planks, the nominees, and then talking about women in politics. And then at the next meeting, they have the Republican platform and the planks and what to know about them and reforms in politics suggested by women's suffrage. But other than this, there's no mention of women in political engagement at all in the Martin study clubs. In fact, what we see happening after World War I, even with the advent of suffrage, is that the women in these study clubs just revert back to what they were doing before the war. They don't take that activism and engagement from the Red Cross and translate it into other types of activism. They go back to doing their original intellectual pursuits, whether it's music or studying literature or studying arts. They will work on a few civic improvements, but not a lot. The ladies' room and playground at one of the parks, they'll raise some money for. But really what ends up happening is that a new women's club is formed. The Martin's Women's Club is formed to coordinate civic activities in general. So the study clubs are focused on their studying, and an actual civic engagement club is formed instead. All of these clubs put aside their intellectual pursuits, their desire for improvement in education, to focus on the war effort. They take all of those skills and knowledge that they learned from having these clubs and their independent actions, and they apply it to the war and working with the Red Cross. The Federation gives them the opportunity to become involved in some civic engagement, and they do on a somewhat limited scale, but they don't really translate from being a club focused on studying to being involved in self-improvement and community improvement. They're really focused more on themselves. And it turns out that's what they wanted. Is first and foremost, they want the opportunity to engage in intellectual pursuits, something that they weren't getting elsewhere. But at the same time, they were constantly building these skills. So when an emergency occurred, like World War I, they had the ability to work in the public sphere because they'd been practicing it in this middle ground within their private clubs. To take this up to date, each of these clubs is still around today. The Philharmonic Club is now integrated. It has men and women who are a part of it. The 20th Century Club and the Fortnightly Club still meet regularly. The Fortnightly Club does not meet every 2 weeks. Instead, they meet just once a month. And the Fortnightly Club, at least, rather than having members present and create the programs, they bring people in from the outside to present. But all three clubs are active and vibrant today in Martin, 100 years after they were created. And so people like Virginia Gardner and the founders of the Fortnightly Club and Frances Poynter, I guess, realized that there was a need for something like this within the community, to have this intellectual pursuits, particularly for women who didn't necessarily have those opportunities elsewhere. And so we have this middle ground. this space that allows women to be active in the way that men are in public, but they can do it within the confines and the safety of their own clubs. Thank you.